Hello quilty friends, are you ready to get started? We're finally ready to start embroidering our big, gigantic, gorgeous tree skirt. Each month what we're going to be doing is one wedge, okay? So we're gonna sew what's called an inner block, which is the block closest to the center of the tree skirt, a main block, which the main blocks are the buildings, and an outer block. And the outer blocks are either the block that has a gift on it or a block that has snowmen on it. This month we're going to start with this wedge, which has the church and the snowmen and just plain stars and snowflakes on the inner block. After that we're going to proceed around the tree skirt this way so that when we get to the little bit harder, more intensive inner blocks, you've had several months to practice them, okay? So the inner block we sew this week is actually going to be, we're going to do it 9 times. You need to know that on your stick, what you got from Juju, there are a lot of things. There's your embroidery files, which how to open those are addressed in the other videos that I've sent to you this week. We've actually did a video for each block that we made this week. So if you are new to this or you just want a refresher, watch those videos. But on the stick, on your files that you download from Juju, there are also a few other very important things. One is this massive tutorial, okay? And those of you who've done Kimberbell and like her step-by-step directions, Juju has done the exact same thing. This is a 95-page file. You are probably going to use at some point the first 4 or 5 pages. That, for those of you that are used to embroidery, is where you get your cutting directions, or which we've done all the cutting for you, but if you're ever unclear about what size something should be or that, it's all listed in here. I've also told you on the thread charts that you'll be receiving exactly what steps each block is. So for example, inner block 9 I think uses, I'm sorry, the outer block uses steps like 235 to 255 or something. I've noted that on the thread charts that we have made for you, and if you want to see exactly what is going to happen in each step, or you want a step-by-step tutorial other than the videos we've made this month, that's all in this gigantic tutorial, and it's called a tutorial in her directions. In her directions, she's also sent you thread charts. The thread chart, her thread charts look like this. Those of you who are used to embroidery, you're used to seeing things like this. We are also sending you our custom thread charts, and I'm going to show you those well, actually I'm going to show them to you right now. So this is the thread chart for inner block 9. And I just dropped our thread chart for inner block 9 because that's the kind of day I'm having. Our thread chart for inner block 9 is going to tell you the stop number, which correspond with the stop number on Juju's charts, okay? It's described for you exactly what's going to happen during that stop, which corresponds to exactly what Juju says. And then I've given you our, if you're using our thread chart, our threads, excuse me, our thread kit, what number you should use, what thread number, number 10 is white, and the name of the color. If you aren't using exquisite threads, that's fine. What you're going to do is you can approximate the color, or you can use Juju's thread charts to see exactly what's being stitched out and match your thread to her descriptions, if that gives you a little bit better idea. Or you can come in and talk to me and I'll try to explain it even better, okay? Okay, so each month or each week I should say, when it's time for you to pick up your kits, and that's all in your calendar you got last time, your kits are going to be in your stocking. So Santa is going to come and deliver your fabric to your stocking, and you can see right now Marilyn is the only one who's gotten a gift. But when you come in and you'll pick it up and your fabric will be in there. This first month, we're going to print out the thread charts and put them in your stockings. But after this month, we are not going to print your thread charts. I'm going to email those to you. We have cut all of the fabric pieces for all of the kits the same size. So they're all big enough to make the large tree skirt. If you are making a medium or a small, you are welcome to trim your fabric down, or you're welcome to just use it and trim more off, okay? It was a decision for us on how to preserve fabric in that, and it was just easier for us to cut everybody the same size kits, okay? So that is not a mistake. That is what was supposed to happen. And again, you can trim your fabric down or just trim it off in the hoop applique process. Okay, so each week, excuse me, we are going to make a wedge. It is my suggestion that when you have completed your 3 pieces, you go ahead and sew your wedge together. You don't have to. If you would like to move your buildings around, don't sew your wedges together. The reason I suggest you do it is because it'll mean less sewing at the end. But if you want to move your buildings around, then just go ahead and leave them all loose. I'm going to demo really quick how to sew the wedges together because there are always some questions about where you want to sew, and Juju's tutorials I didn't find to be very clear, so I'm going to clear that all up for you. Okay, so over here I have our three blocks that we've made. This is your inner block, this is your main block, and your outer block I have still in the hoop over here. Okay, these are really easy to trim up if you have the right tools. You can use your regular quilting ruler, that's fine, but we also have this tool called the Trimmer by George, and what this does is it helps you trim away your stabilizer, because when you take it out of the hoop, there is batting in here, but you can see the batting is trapped between your stabilizer and your background fabric, so you don't have to worry about that. But Juju tells you to trim a ½ inch away from your background tack down line, which is easy to do with your regular rotary cutting ruler, but you want to get the excess stabilizer out of there and out of your seams. So this tool lets you pull back your background fabric, put this right up against your stitching, and then they tell you to use a 60mm rotary cutter, but I haven't had any trouble using just our regular one. And then what this lets you do is it gives you've got a nice big piece of stabilizer. If you've got to make a small project, you can hang on to those. So again, you just slide it back, cut your stabilizer away, on all 4 sides. And then I can grab, after I'm done with this, then I can grab my regular rotary cutting ruler and trim a ½ inch away from my stitching lines. Now these can be hard to see because I stitched it out with white so that if anything peeked through.
How far did the George cut it away?
Oh, the George you can see on the back, it trimmed your stabilizer right to that stitching line. So now that won't be in your seam allowance when you stitch it out. If you have trouble seeing this white thread through your rotary cutter, or through your regular rotary cutting ruler, just grab a friction pen and put a couple of marks so you can see those better. And then you just trim your excess background fabric away.
And this is a ½ inch.
This is at a ½ inch, yeah. So we're going to do that for all 3 blocks. And this inner block and the main block are easy to do. but your outer block has a curve on it. So we're going to talk about how to deal with that in just a second. So again, you've got your stabilizer still attached. Your George slips right up and holds back your background fabric.
Tell them the story about it. It's called By George.
It's called By George because Hoop Sisters is the company that makes this, and they have a quilt shop and they have an embroidery thing, an embroidery company. And there was a woman who worked at the quilt shop, and her name was Martha, actually, and she was always complaining that she couldn't get close enough. There was no good tool to trim her stabilizer away. So her husband, George, invented the trimmer by George. He used to make them in his garage, and I think he used tin, is what they said, on the edge of regular rotary cutting rulers. And then George passed away, and they had to have the George trimmer made in a, more traditional factory setting now. But they're on their third version of it because George 1 was the one that George made by himself in his garage. So, okay, when you get to your outer block, your third block, everything is great until you got to deal with this curve. So what I actually do is grab a friction pen and a little seam gauge, and I put the seam gauge at 1/2 inch, and I'm going to mark all along. You can see I did some of it already. You're going to mark a 1/2 inch away from the curve. And I like to do this before I take it out of the hoop because it's so nice and flat. Okay, so now we've got our trimming line marked. So we're going to take it out of the hoop. And then I'm going to use George for these 3 sides. I'm going to use them on the bottom too, but it's not as easy. Move those. It's the kind of day I'm having. I would just roll right over them. So you trim these 3 sides, and then I'm going to use George on the bottom, but you have to be a little tricky, I guess. Because it is a curve, we're just going to do as much as we can. It's going to be a little bit more like dot to dot, where you're trying to make a curve with straight lines. So you just do a little bit at a time. And the other nice thing about this is if you keep all this back, you don't accidentally run over your background fabric, which I did on the first tree skirt. Then you have to restitch your block, and that's no fun. So you can see that even though we had to go a little bit at a time, we still have a really nice trimming, and you can go back and clean it up a little bit if you want to, so that you get really close to your stitching lines there too. So now I'm going to trim a 1/2 inch away again with my rotary cutter and my ruler on 3 sides, and then I'm going to use my scissors for the 4th side. And these are stitched, these stitching lines are in gray. I did that so you guys could see on the video what I was doing. If you want to stitch those placement lines or those tack down lines in a color other than white, you can, but you're about to see why the white is a nice alternative. So now I just connect up my lines with my scissors. And I have a very nice curve on the end. Okay? So now when you go to sew these guys together, ideally your background tack down lines are what match up exactly. But you're going to do it right sides together, so it can be a little bit harder to see where you want to sew exactly. So what I do is this. First, I grab pins and I stick the pin, through the corner, the outer stitching line. I'm going to stick my pin through the corner of that. And I want it to come out, and that really made a little bit of a mess there, on the same corner of the outer stitching line. Sorry, can't see. There we go. So the pin is coming out in the corner of the stitching line here and the corner of the outer stitching line here. And then I do pin. I pin these. I want them to stay nice and flat and together. But before I pin the rest of it, I go to the other end. You can clip these too if you prefer Wonder Clips. And I'm going to do the same thing there. I'm going to put the pin through that outer stitch, the corner of the outer stitching line, and the corner of the outer stitching line on the bottom. So it's coming out the same place on both. And then pin that down. And then I'm going to put a couple of pins, or you can put Wonder Clips, so that this doesn't shift while I'm sewing. And then when I sew, I'm going to sew between those two lines of stitching. So this inner one is your batting tack down line, and the outer one is your background fabric tack down line, and I'm going to try to sew directly between them. Okay, I have a foot on my machine. I have the HP foot on my machine, and it's got a slit down the middle of it that's exactly that wide, and you'll see how it lines up. And I'm going to sew directly down the middle. I also, when I sew these things together, I backstitch at the beginning and the end. I don't want these things to come apart. So what you can see here is I've got this the outer line of stitching running right up against this edge, right, the inner edge of the foot right there. And this line of stitching is going to run along the edge of the foot right there. So one line of stitching is going to line up here. One line of stitching is going to go along the foot here. Okay?
Okay, and you're starting at that corner.
I'm going to start, yeah, I'm not going to sew out in here. I'm not out here, because when we sew the wedges together, we're going to come right down between these two lines of stitching. Okay? So I'm going to start, I actually started at the outer line, but you can, yeah, okay? And I've got my stitch length set at 1.8, and I am going to back stitch a little bit. And I'm going to sew straight down the middle. Pull that pin out. It jumped. I caught it though. And then I'm going to keep going. And ideally, when I'm done, you won't see any lines of stitching, these tack down lines, you won't be visible. Okay, so I'm going to get to the right between the two lines of stitching where they start to come down the sides, and then back stitch. Okay. Now, you can see there's no, you can actually, the tension on that machine messed up. But, so I'm gonna have to restitch it. But you can see that my gray tack down lines are gone, okay? So now what I would do is I would press this open because I'm trying to get as much bulk out of these seams as I can. So I'll press that open, and I will also sew, I'm gonna rethread that real fast, and then I'm gonna sew these guys together. Doing the same thing. Now this one I had tacked down in white, and if you have trouble seeing, all I did was I ran my friction pen along the edge of the stitching so that you guys would be able to see it on the video. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to take my pin and I'm going to put it through the outer corner line of stitching, and then I'm going to put it through that same outer corner line of stitching here. Pin those two guys together. And then I'm going to do the same thing at the other end. That's lined up. And then I'm going to put a couple of more pins in to hold it so it doesn't shift, because there's a lot of bulk here. There's just the 2 layers of fabric here, and there's fabric and batting and stabilizer ×2. So what the machine wants to do is push these apart, and we don't want that to happen. So that's why we want to pin. And then I'm going to quickly check the bobbin on this, because I don't want to have to resew the top one. And I'm also going to tell you that if you had stitched that and when you opened it up, it went, one of your lines of stitching, one of those tack down lines, was still visible, then what you want to do, you don't have to take your stitching out. What you would do was, if it was this line of stitching that was still visible, you would just flip it over and sew right on the line of stitching that was still visible, and 90% of the time that stitching line then disappears. All right, again, we're going to start the outer stitch line. We're going to line it up so that my 2 lines of stitching go right down the center of the foot, and we're sewing right between them. And I'm going to back stitch. I've got a thread. Get to the end, I'm going to back stitch a little bit. Pull my last 2 pins out. And when I open it up, there you go. My stitching lines are gone. And these lines match up here and almost right here, and you're good there. So now all I'm going to do is I'm going to press my seams open so that it lays nice and flat, and then I'm going to set this wedge aside until October, which will be here before we know it, and when we're ready to sew them all together. Okay? If you have any questions, call the shop, email me, you can talk to me or Jan. Jan is doing this too. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, okay? Good luck.